200 miles from land at 39,000 feet, both engines died. No fire, no explosion, just silence, and a slow fall toward the sea. How did anyone survive? It began with silence. Not the silence of peace, but the kind that follows a sound you expected and didn't hear. Outside the cockpit windows, the sky was clear, almost unnaturally calm. Below, the South China Sea shimmered like glass. There was no storm, no turbulence, no warning, just altitude and the faint, unsettling absence of power. At 39,000 feet, flight CATHAY780 was a silver needle in the sky. 2 engines, or rather, 1.5 now, strained quietly beneath the wings. The right engine, engine number 2, had just stopped responding. Not suddenly, but with a slow decay, like a breath fading before it's finished. A soft thump, a subtle vibration, then nothing. Inside the cockpit, Captain Malcolm Waters leaned forward. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Beside him, First Officer David Hayhoe was already checking the screens. The electronic centralized aircraft monitor, the ECAM, had confirmed it. Abnormal thrust response. Engine 2 wasn't providing power, but the indicators, strangely, still looked functional. The Airbus A330 was holding altitude, but just barely. Engine 1, the left side, was now carrying the full weight of a fully loaded 180-ton aircraft. A single source of thrust, somewhere over open water. David glanced at Malcolm. Malcolm didn't blink. He had flown this aircraft for over 2,600 hours. He knew what it should feel like, and what it shouldn't. A message was sent to air traffic control. Pan-pan. That wasn't a mayday, not yet. Pan-pan meant urgency, not emergency. It meant they were still in control, but they were getting close to not being. In the cabin, the passengers were quiet. Breakfast had been served earlier. A few children were asleep. A businessman typed on a laptop, oblivious to the fact that just behind the cockpit door, 2 pilots were trying to keep 309 people from disappearing into the sea. Then came the second failure. It began like the first. Software delayed. An ECAM alert. Engine 1, slow response. That phrase. It sat heavy on the screen. No sound followed. Just a sharp stillness. Then the smell. Ozone. Faint but distinct. A warning from the machine that something deeper, something mechanical, was beginning to fall apart. David reached for the thrust lever. No change. Malcolm tried again. Nothing. Engine 1 wasn't responding to input. Not completely dead, but not alive either. And now, over 200 kilometers from land, the Airbus was flying with 0 functional engines. They weren't descending because they chose to. They were descending because they no longer had a choice. The cockpit remained quiet. No one cursed, no one panicked. Only checklists, executed from memory, rehearsed 1,000 times in simulations that never felt quite like this. They tried to relight the engines. Nothing. They adjusted airflow, reset power systems. The auxiliary power unit, or APU, kicked in, but it wouldn't bring back the thrust. Below them, the ocean waited. Malcolm's hands gripped the side stick. He wasn't steering now. He was guiding, gliding, watching every meter of altitude tick away. And somewhere in that thin, cold air, with the sun pouring across the cockpit glass, he began calculating something that no pilot ever wants to measure. Not how to fly, but how to fall. Long before the silence, before the smell of ozone, before the sky turned from a canvas of calm to a corridor of uncertainty, there had been a morning, a routine, a checklist completed without hesitation. The aircraft, An Airbus A330 sat quietly on the tarmac of Juanda International Airport in Surabaya, Indonesia. The sun hadn't fully risen when Captain Malcolm Waters stepped out for his final walk-around. It was warm, humid. There was a quiet hiss as fuel hoses pumped kerosene into the wings. 24 tons of fuel, standard for the route. Nothing unusual. He checked the landing gear, the paneling, the engine cowlings. He paused at engine 2, the right side, and ran his hand along the metal edge. Everything was in place, clean, secure. He nodded to the ground crew and walked back up the steps. In the cockpit, First Officer David Hayhoe was already setting up the flight management system. He was calm, methodical. Before joining Cathay Pacific, he had flown for the Royal Australian Air Force. This wasn't his first aircraft, wasn't his first long haul. Like Malcolm, he had done this more times than he could count. The aircraft was nearly 12 years old, maintained meticulously, certified for extended twin operations, ETOPS compliant. If one engine failed, it could fly for hours on the other. That was the theory. That was the regulation. That was what the manual said. Outside, 309 passengers boarded. Families, business travelers, tourists. They moved through the jet bridge, some pausing to look at the massive white fuselage. Most didn't. At 0824 local time, flight CATHAY780 lifted off. The morning haze shimmered across the runway behind them. They climbed through layers of thin cloud and emerged into a soft blue, the kind of sky that gives no warning. The climb was smooth, but something wasn't. It was subtle, a number barely shifting, a value on the ECAM. The engine pressure ratio, or EPR, on engine 2, it fluctuated slightly. Not a spike, not a drop, just a hesitation. Malcolm stared at it for a few seconds, then he moved on. It didn't trip a warning. It wasn't outside the normal range. A few minutes later, engine 1 showed a smaller version of the same irregularity. It wasn't identical, but it was close enough to raise the same feeling. They checked the other indicators, temperatures, fuel flow, vibration readings. Everything else seemed stable. No message, no fault, nothing they could act on. That's how it starts sometimes. Not with a bang, not with a siren, but with a flicker, a moment you think you imagined. Then it disappears, and you convince yourself you were wrong. By the time they reached cruising altitude, 39,000 feet, the engines were quiet again. No further fluctuations. The EPR had returned to its expected values. They pressed on. It was a 5-hour flight to Hong Kong. They had done it before, hundreds of times. Still, Malcolm felt it. In his chest, a kind of static. Not fear exactly, not even anxiety, but a weight, like something was being stored, waiting for the right moment to uncoil. Then, over the sea, the first real warning came. Engine 2, slow response. He called David's attention to it. They ran the checklist, cross-checked the readings. The engine was still running, still producing thrust, but it wasn't reacting, like a voice behind glass, muffled, distorted. They contacted Cathay's Operations Control Center on the ground. A technician came on the radio, calm, professional. He asked them to cycle the thrust lever, to monitor EPR again. They did. The numbers didn't move much. Still, fuel flow, oil pressure, and turbine temperature all appeared normal. No fire, no overheat, no failure code. They were told it was safe to continue. No immediate threat. But they had seen this before. Not in their own flights, but in incident reports. Accidents where the system looked healthy until it didn't. It wasn't just data. It was something deeper, a machine that looked alive but wasn't listening, and somewhere over the calm, blue vastness of the South China Sea, that machine was about to go quiet. Let me know when you're ready for Part 3, Between the Sky and the Sea. I'll continue the same careful, immersive tone, no repetition, no filler, just the unfolding truth, told with clarity and feeling. At the 38,000 feet the warnings returned, but this time they were clearer, louder, not in sound but in what they meant. The ECAM displayed another message. Engine 2. Abnormal response confirmed. A vibration spike. A mismatch between fuel flow and actual thrust. The readings no longer matched the behavior. There was no denying it now. This engine wasn't just sluggish. It was failing. Captain Waters reduced the throttle for Engine 2, letting it idle. There was no smoke, no fire, nothing violent. Just a slow, deliberate death, the kind that doesn't look like danger until it's too late. David ran through the restart procedure. It didn't work. Seconds passed, then minutes. The right engine had gone silent. They had prepared for this in training. They had practiced engine-out approaches, engine-out climbs, but never this high, never this far from land, and never with what came next. Because just as they began settling into a single engine descent, another warning appeared. Engine 1. The message was familiar. Slow response. Unreliable data. The numbers didn't make sense. The behavior didn't match the input. They tried to adjust thrust. The lever moved. The engine didn't. Then the smell returned. Ozone. Hot metal. In the cockpit, silence took on a new texture. Heavier now, almost physical. Malcolm didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes locked onto the instrument panel, then to the horizon. He adjusted the pitch manually, correcting for drag imbalance. David, calm but focused, monitored engine readings, watching as the last reliable figures began to blur. They sent out the call. Mayday, 3 times. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Flight CATHAY780. Dual engine failure. We are gliding. Request immediate clearance for shortest approach to Hong Kong International. There was no panic in the voice, just urgency. The controlled tone of someone walking a rope that's starting to fray. They were over the sea now, 200 kilometers southeast of Hong Kong, with no power left in the right engine and the left one fading. Slowly, but steadily. Malcolm reached again for the restart checklist. He moved methodically. Each step was a gamble. If he overloaded the system, he could lose the last bit of thrust. But if he did nothing, the aircraft would become a glider. An A330 is not built for gliding. It can descend with grace for a while, yes, but not forever. Not this heavy, not this far. The auxiliary power unit, the APU, was online. Emergency systems kicked in. The ram air turbine, RAT, deployed into the airstream, generating just enough power to run hydraulics and flight controls. But nothing could restart the engines. Not yet. Below them, the ocean waited. Still. Blue. Endless. It was strange how peaceful it looked. From above it shimmered, soft and indifferent. No storm, no waves, just a flat sheet of possibility. Both beautiful and final. Inside the aircraft, the cabin remained quiet. No announcement had been made. The flight attendants had been instructed to prepare for landing, to secure the cabin, to watch for smoke, to be ready for anything. They didn't say water landing. They didn't say ditching. But in their eyes, something had shifted. Malcolm adjusted the flight path, easing the aircraft toward land. He wasn't flying anymore. He was negotiating. Every decision, pitch, yaw, airspeed, was a trade. Altitude for time, control for momentum, life for risk. Then, after long minutes of tension, something changed. The readings on engine 1 twitched. N1, the rotational speed of the low-pressure compressor, began to rise. Slowly. 10%, 20, then 70. It held. For the first time in over 20 minutes, they had usable thrust. Not much, just enough. David watched the gauges. Malcolm leaned forward again, hands steady. They didn't celebrate. They didn't speak. There was no time for that. They were still too far, still too high, still flying an aircraft with only partial control, and one compromised engine that could fail again at any moment. But now, they had something they didn't have before. A chance. Let me know when you're ready for Part 4, Fire on the Runway. I'll carry the same quiet intensity forward with precision, clarity, and emotion. No repetition, just the unfolding truth. The lights of Hong Kong finally broke through the haze. It wasn't a runway yet, just a shimmer in the distance, blurred by altitude and fatigue. But it was enough. Enough to keep them steady. Enough to aim for. Enough to believe for the first time that they might not have to touch water. The engine held. Engine 1, battered but alive, stayed locked at 74% N1. No throttle response. No fine-tuned control. Just a fixed, stubborn push. Enough to keep them in the air, but not enough to slow them when they came down. They began their descent, shallow, calculated, without grace. The aircraft was heavy, still near its landing limit. Drag from the failed engine made it harder to maintain direction. Malcolm compensated, hands firm on the side stick. Every movement, every input, felt like it echoed through the fuselage. David ran the landing checklist. Not all of it applied. There were too many variables outside the book now. They focused on what mattered: speed, gear, flaps, spoilers, brakes. They had no reversers on the right engine, and on the left, the system might not respond at all. At 5,000 feet, the city began to emerge, gray outlines of buildings beneath layers of cloud. The radio crackled with the voice of approach control. They were cleared to land on runway 07 left. A full emergency declared. All other traffic held or diverted. Malcolm adjusted their alignment, eyes fixed on the approach path. But the airspeed wouldn't drop. They were too fast, far too fast. Normally, an A330 touches down at about 135 knots. Today, they were still above 210. He tried to pull back the thrust. Nothing changed. The engine wouldn't let go. The aircraft was coming in hot. Too hot. But they had no choice. Circling wasn't an option. Go around was impossible. This was it. David armed the ground spoilers. They would deploy on contact. He also activated the auto brake, set to maximum, but they didn't trust it. Not fully, not today. Malcolm aimed long. He needed to use every meter of concrete. 3,000 feet, then 2. The runway stretched beneath them, long, straight, quiet. Then, contact. The main gear hit hard. A shudder passed through the cabin. The aircraft bounced, lifted again, then slammed down a second time, harder than the first. The left engine struck the runway, scraping against the asphalt. Sparks bloomed beneath the wing. The thrust reversers, only on the left side, activated. But with thrust still locked at 74%. They worked against the brakes, not with them. Smoke trailed behind them. The nose wheel touched down. The cabin jolted. Inside, passengers screamed. Overhead bins rattled. The air filled with the smell of rubber and metal. Then came the fire warning. The brakes were burning. tires had burst. The left engine, still running, was now glowing orange at the seams. Malcolm brought the aircraft to a stop using full manual braking. The auto brake had failed to keep up. The aircraft rolled nearly the full length of the runway, then silence again. But it wasn't peace. It was waiting to see what would fail next. David triggered the APU shutdown. The engine still didn't respond. They couldn't shut it off. Flames licked around the gear well. Malcolm called for evacuation. The doors opened with the sound of pressurized release. Slides deployed. The cabin crew, trained for moments like this, moved into position. They gave orders, firm, sharp, in multiple languages. Passengers stumbled, screamed, jumped. Some hesitated. Some grabbed bags. One man tried to bring his suitcase down the slide and fell awkwardly at the bottom. A child cried out, then disappeared into a flight attendant's arms. The cabin was clearing, but not fast enough. The smoke thickened. A warning tone echoed from the cockpit. Another heat sensor triggered. David opened the cockpit door. No flames inside, but the smell was close now. Rubber, wiring, something synthetic beginning to melt. They swept the cabin. No one left behind. Then they left too. Down the slide, into the lights, onto the pavement. Knees buckling slightly from adrenaline and gravity. Emergency crews were already on site. Foam coated the left gear. The engine hissed, but it held. It never exploded. It never gave up. Like the aircraft itself, it simply refused to die. Behind them, on that long black strip of scorched runway, was what was left of a flight that had no business surviving. And yet, it had. The investigation didn't begin with urgency. It began with silence. Not the kind found in a cockpit or on a runway or in the final seconds of a Mayday call, but the silence of absence, of uncertainty, of people standing still, trying to make sense of a machine that almost failed without ever braking. The aircraft was moved to a secure hangar. Its engines, blackened and bruised, still warm to the touch, were shut down, tagged, and sealed. Inside the maintenance bay, there were no obvious signs of catastrophic damage. No compressor stalls, no blade detachment, no burnt-through lines. The engines, as strange as it sounded, were intact. So the question remained, why had they stopped? The flight data recorder was pulled. Alongside it, the cockpit voice recorder. Not because there had been a crash. There hadn't. But because in every way that mattered, they had reached the edge of one. It took time. Not hours, but days. When the data was finally extracted, something peculiar surfaced. Both engines had received full fuel flow commands. The throttles were working. The electronic control units were working. But downstream, something was choking the system. Fuel wasn't reaching the combustion chambers in the right amount, at the right pressure, or sometimes at all. The investigators went deeper. They dismantled the fuel metering units, precision devices designed to control exactly how much fuel enters the engine's core. And what they found was soft. Not metal, not dirt, but clusters of small, gelatinous beads, translucent, sticky, strange. They looked like fragments of silicone or hardened gel, not mechanical debris, not residue from combustion. They were something else. The chemical analysis came later. These were polymer beads, superabsorbent, the kind used in industrial filtration, but not something meant to be inside a Rolls-Royce Trent engine. The search moved backward, not into the aircraft, but into the ground, back through the fuel tanks, the pumps, the transfer lines, back to Surabaya, to the fueling trucks, the hydrants, the underground pipes. And then, the mistake revealed itself. Weeks before the flight, maintenance had been performed on part of the airport's fueling system. New filters had been installed. To test the lines, technicians used water. It wasn't drained properly. Some of it stayed in the system. When fuel flowed through again, it picked up traces of water. And worse, it carried with it the very polymers meant to absorb that water. They had swollen. Microscopic at first, but as they moved from pipe to tank to aircraft, they clumped together. Dozens became hundreds, then thousands. Inside the aircraft's fuel system, they passed through the coarser filters. They made it to the engines, and then they did what polymers are designed to do. They absorbed, they expanded, they lodged, and then they blocked. Not completely, not suddenly, but enough. Enough to confuse the engine's control logic. Enough to restrict fuel flow under certain conditions. Enough to keep the pilots guessing until it was too late. And yet, not once during fueling did any gauge show contamination. Not once did any maintenance record flag the batch, because it wasn't the fuel. It was the system around it. The problem wasn't in the cockpit or the wings or the design of the engine. It was beneath the ground, in a pipeline, in a valve, in a step skipped because someone thought a little water wouldn't matter. The horror of it wasn't just technical. It was quiet. There had been no explosion, no fireball, no mid-air breakup, just silence, and a machine that stopped listening. In the report, the cause was classified as fuel contamination due to polymer absorption material entering the fuel metering units. The wording was sterile, correct, but it said nothing of what was felt at 39,000 feet. Nothing of the weight of flying without power, of choosing between sea and sky, of walking away from fire and metal and knowing. It was all so preventable. The flight crew was later honored, not just for saving lives, but for staying calm inside a machine they no longer understood, for holding on when everything else slipped away. And the passengers, most of them, never knew how close they came, how close the ocean had been, how far from normal that flight had drifted, until somehow it made it home. The Airbus was eventually repaired. It flew again for a few years, then retired quietly, like many aircraft do, parked beneath a wide desert sky, lined up with others that had served their time. But not all aircraft carry stories like this one. Some are just machines. Others remember.